Hello, it's Rafael Gutierrez, and today I'm going to talk about where you can feel certain bony projections. I'm going to talk about ligaments, and I'm going to tell you about the basics of muscle embryology. The reason I've arranged this a certain way is because what I've found teaching anatomy is a lot of times people will read the book to you, and when they do this, it doesn't make sense to students. A lot of times people will do every tissue known to man in the first month, then they'll do bones for about half a month, muscles for half a month, and everything else gets tossed on in the last month. I didn't feel that worked for me, and I've changed the order how I've taught tradition. And I found that this ended up working a lot better. I was able to give a lot more information. I was able to use functional information. I was able to increase my pass rate by quite a bit. So that's one of the things I want to share with anyone and everyone who wants to try something different. Now, when it comes to ligaments, I'm not going to talk about all of them. I'm just going to talk about clinical aspects that you will come across over and over again. A lot of them how they're named is actually pretty simple, and I'm hoping that I can give you something that when you look at the muscles, you'll be able to understand how and why they function a certain way. Hopefully, everything will work out okay with this. Back, and I'm wearing the tight white t-shirt, so you can see certain areas that I'm going to point out. And I'm just going to tell you certain areas that in the face and everywhere where you can feel bones. Now, it's obvious that you can actually feel the maxilla here. And this area here has actually a hollow cavity called the maxillary sinus. Up in here, and you have a sinus here, which is just an empty cavity called the frontal sinus. The other thing to actually look at is when you look at the eardrum, the ear, you can see the hole going in, which is the external acoustic meatus. And if you go behind, the other thing to actually look at is when you look at the eardrum, the ear, you can see the hole going in, which is the external acoustic meatus. And if you go behind here, you have a big lump, which is the mastoid process. One of the things is, if you can actually see yourself, if you can see where these things are on yourself, you can feel them, you can tell where you're going to be. Now, one of the things I always tell people to do is just to show you how the temporal mandibular joint works is put your two fingers right behind your ear, right where the temporal mandibular joint is. You're going to go actually high, and if you open your mouth, you'll notice that the mandible actually slides forward. You'll see the angle go back, but where your finger is back here, you'll feel that there's more space. And the reason that's important is so your teeth, when you bite, can actually cut this way. If not, you'd actually just be doing something like this. That is one of the big things to look at. You can also, if you feel the lower portion of your neck, you can find the spine really back here of the 7th cervical vertebrae, which is called the cervical protrusions. You can also find the clavicle, and you can find the spine of the scapula, and you can find where the clavicle and the acromial process come together. Tight white t-shirt so you can see a little bit, and you have the sternal end here with sternum. Now, as you go down the rib, you'll find that there's an area here, which there's a big lump. That's the sternal angle that I told you about, and it helps you find the second intercostal space. The reason that's important is that helps you find some of the heart valves when you get into cardiovascular. Going on your arm, which I'll do the arm upper body first, you actually have the two wing projections, one here and one here. It's really more on the back. And that is your medial over here, medial side, remember anatomical position, and lateral epicondyle. As you go to the elbow, the tip of the elbow, you have your olecranon process, which remember goes into the olecranon fossa. And you can feel the ulna running all the way down the medial portion of your arm. Your radius, you'll notice that it's really hard to feel it unless you go into the antecubital fossa here and rotate your arm around. You can then end up feeling part of it there. You can feel a little divot between your deltoid, pectoralis, and your clavicle, and if you press there and rotate your arm around, you will feel two bumps, which are the greater and lesser tubercle there. If you move a little more medial, you can sometimes feel the coracoid process. As we get to the hand, on the ulna, I told you how you can feel it on the lateral side. You can feel the big round projection there, which is the head, and then if you press hard right at the wrist here, you can feel another bony projection, which is the styloid process. So the styloid process is here. The head is that big lump you have here. And the radius, the head's over here. You can actually feel the tuberosity if you rotate in and out. You can find the styloid process of the radius up here. If you can see these two ligaments here, one here, that's actually the area of the scaphoid. Continuing down the body, what we actually do have is, if you come to this area here, don't laugh at my 42-year-old body, is you can feel the bone here, which is your iliac crest. If you move medial from both of them and go in the middle, about here, you find L4, L5. Now that's a very important landmark because people do spinal taps. Going down to the knee, you can't see the patella, and on me you can see the tibial tuberosity here. You can also feel two parts of the femur. These are your medial and lateral epicondyles. Besides that, you can feel the greater trochanter of the femur right around this area here. Anterior here, posterior here, midway you'll find a divot. That's where you can actually feel the greater trochanter. As you go to the tibia, you can see that you can feel the tibial tuberosity here, and you can feel all the way down to the medial malleolus. This is actually all part of the tibia. The fibula, you'll actually can find on the other leg on the lateral side, and it's pretty much this here. Now, as there are a lot of ligaments, I am going to use my lab manual, and what I would tell you to do is if you have a list of ligaments people want you to know, draw them out on these pictures. I'm actually only going to talk about a couple of them. Most of them you can tell by the name where they are. Ones I do want to talk about are some that have a really interesting clinical importance. For instance, if we come over here and radius come together and the ulna, you have a ligament that goes from the ulna and wraps around the head, all the way around. So you'd end up having a ligament here called the annular ligament. The reason that ligament is so important is someone were to yank someone, like a child, let's say, it can end up causing the radius to come out of position, a dislocation or subluxation, and that's called a nursemaid subluxation. In the hands, this one here, you have the dorsum of the hand. So the thumb is over here, the pinky's over here, and you have the carpal bones here. You have a ligament that goes from this side of the carpal bones and goes all the way to the other side here. This actually makes what's known as a transverse carpal ligament. It's important because 10 things go underneath it. 9 of them are tendons and 1 nerve, which is really important. The nerve that goes under there is the median nerve. And so sometimes people have carpal tunnel syndrome where the median nerve gets pinched off or inflamed. And so what they have to do is they come and they cut the transverse carpal ligament found here on the knee. Remember, tibia is going to be medial, fibula is going to be lateral. So you have a ligament that goes from the femur to roughly the fibula here, which is called the fibular collateral ligament. You also have one going to the tibia, which will be the tibial collateral ligament. They're also known as the medial collateral ligament for the tibia and lateral collateral for the fibula. And you also have the patellar ligament here, and inside you have a series of other ligaments, which I'm going to have to draw for you. If we're looking at the knee, we have the tibial plateau, we have the intercondylar eminence between it, we have the tibial tuberosity, and to give you a sign of what medial and lateral is, we'll actually draw this, the fibula. Here, so we have the fibula and the tibia. So knowing that the fibula is here, we know this is lateral and this is medial. The femur would end up coming up here. You have the condyles, epicondyles would come protruding off the sides here. And what we have is we have the ligament that I told you about coming here, which, as this is fibular and lateral, so it's a lateral collateral ligament or fibular collateral ligament. Over here, you have another ligament, which is your medial collateral ligament, and between this you have fiber cartilage, which we talked about, and you have another area over here called the meniscus. So you have the medial meniscus and the lateral meniscus here. Besides that, you have a pair of ligaments here which are going to cross. One of them's going from the front here, and it's going to go all the way to the back. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to draw it so we can see that it's going here from the front here and attaching posterior. The other one is going to start from the posterior side here. And so it's going to go under the top one and come across to the front here. So what we have is we have a pair of ligaments that cross. As this one's anterior, we'll call it the anterior cruciate ligament. As this one's posterior, we'll call it the posterior cruciate ligament. Now, the reason these two ligaments are really important, all these ligaments are important, is if you look at the knee, there's really not much holding it together. It's not like the elbow where you have a lot of bones. So what you have is you have these ligaments holding everything in place. Now, one of the things that can happen is if you take a blow to the lateral side here, the knee will open up at an angle this way, like this, which means the medial collateral ligament can be stretched, the medial meniscus can be stretched, and as this is coming open this way, it can end up putting strain on the cruciate ligaments. The truth is, there are some people that have said that the traditional one was ACL, but some are saying that you see PCL just as much. The way clinicians are able to determine whether you have a tear from the anterior cruciate ligament or posterior is through what's called the drawer sign. What usually happens is you get the patient to lie down and you put their knees up like this. And then you push here, and if the tibia slides back, it's a posterior drawer sign. Posterior drawer sign. And what it means is you have a tear in the posterior tibial ligament. What it means is this can slide backwards, so it's posterior drawer sign. If you pull on it and it slides forward, you have an anterior drawer sign, which means the anterior cruciate ligament is ripped. Now remember, you're pulling on the tibia, so if you think about it, if the posterior cruciate ligament, if when pushed, the tibia is pushed, it ends up moving back. It's about the same thing as the femur sliding forward on it. So if you think about it, you have your femur, your tibia here, and the drawer sign you're pushing here. which would be the same as this moving forward. And those are all the ligaments I'm going to talk about today. Now, going back to my lab manual, I wanted to show you this here. This is actually a picture of dense regular connective tissue, which you've seen before in color. And what you can see is you can see the fibroblasts, or fibrocytes, and the collagen fibers running across it. Go here. And so that's your dense regular connective tissue. That is part of what makes most of your ligaments, but it's also found in the tendons of muscles. Now, the other thing you have in muscles, though, is another type of tissue here. Now, big thing you see with this tissue is you'll see these lines alternating between dark and light bands. We also see that these are straight, continuous muscles, and what we see over here are the nuclei. This is a special type of tissue, and it's the first contractile tissue I'm mentioning. And the best way to actually think about it is to break apart the word of the tissue. The tissue is called striated skeletal muscle. Striated means striped. Skeletal tells you from a skeleton, and muscle tells you that it's a muscle. So we have striated, striped, skeletal muscle. And that's what you see here. You see striped layers of stripes inside your muscle. To really understand muscle, we actually do want to talk a little bit about the embryology of it. For that, I am going to have to draw again our cleavage happening, our inner cell mass, our bilaminar disc, our yolk, our amnion. And this continues forming the 3 cell layers we talked about before. Amnion here. And the 3 cell layers are your ectoderm, your mesoderm, and your endoderm. Now, as I mentioned before, the endoderm ended up forming a gut tube, which is attached to the yolk sac. The mesoderm formed a layer around that. It's actually eventually going to split, giving you a couple different cavities. And then you have the ectoderm around all that. So we're talking about meso, endo, and ecto. Now, if you remember, we talked about how in the mesoderm layer, we formed something called a notochord. And on the ectoderm, we've had a pull because of the notochord. Eventually, what you ended up with is, you ended up with an outer layer. We have our outer layer, which is composed of ectoderm. We have our inner layer, which is composed of endoderm. And we have the area between, which is your mesoderm. We talked about the somites. We have our neural tube here. These are somites and their neural tube. What you might remember is I told you about how the somites split into 3 parts. One of them comes around the nervous system and forms the skull and vertebrae, and that was called the sclerotome. One in the middle migrates around, and here will migrate around, and it'll end up forming the muscles. And what that second layer is called your myotome. Now, one thing to remember is I always tell you to look at what names are. Myo usually has to do with muscle. Anytime you see myo, remember it's muscle. That will help you out in a lot of things. Myotomes forms a layer around everything. It fuses in the middle. You also form these limb buds that I told you about, and we'll talk about those. Your skeleton forming on there. And it will also form muscle layers besides here. These cells have everything that a cell would normally have. If we were to look at if we were to draw the cell, we have a nucleus, a cell membrane, we have a weird cytoskeleton, we have a endoplasmic reticulum, which is modified in this case. And the modified endoplasmic reticulum is modified to hold and release calcium. It actually has calcium pumps, so it has calcium ATPase, which breaks ATP, and this releases energy. And it takes calcium from the cytoplasm and pumps it into the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which the sarcoplasmic reticulum is a modified endoplasmic reticulum. You do have the rough endoplasmic reticulum as well. You have ribosomes, you have transmembrane proteins, you have everything you would normally have in a cell. It's just modified a little. There's another thing that ends up happening. The cell ends up fusing to the cells next to it. So these membranes here no longer exist. And so what you end up having these long muscle fibers going from one end of bone to another. And they attach with bones through what I told you, tendons. And this has a special arrangement, which I'm going to draw as well. What you're seeing is the same cell is slightly modified for it to function as a muscle cell. We also do have transmembrane receptor proteins here, which are touched with neurons. And so they much get a message and will contract when they have messages. We'll talk a lot more about that. Before I move on, I do want to actually draw just a cytoskeleton. One of the things you notice is you have these thin filaments bound to some sort of weird looking structure here. I'm going to do it 1, 2, 1, 2, 2 for simplicity. Now these are thin filaments and they're made of a protein called actin. The area here that holds the 2 actin molecules together is called a Z-line. You also have another protein which I drew. This one has 2 heads and 2 tails which kind of form together to form a really thick series of proteins. These thick proteins are called thick filaments, but they're composed of a protein called myosin. Myo again, muscle, so thick filaments. We have thin and thick filaments. We also have another thing you'll notice is you have an area where all you have is a thin filament. So this area here, between here and here, is your eye band. Now, between here and here, where you have all the thick filament, you do have some overlap, you have your A band. An area where you just have the thick filament here, which is your M line. It's actually called your sarcomere, and so you can see how this cytoskeleton is arranged. This will be more important in physiology. Make it easier. If you think of an entire muscle, the dense connective tissue around it, which is going to be called your epimysium, that epimysium holds the entire muscle. Each one of these muscle fascicles is going to be held together by a perimysium. If we were to take this, elongate out, what we find is around each individual one of these muscle fibers, this would be a muscle fiber here, we would have tissue around this called the endomysium, which is around here. So perimysium, it would be all this area around here. The epimysium would be the outer area here. And the one thing that goes around the muscle fiber is the endo. So you have the endo inside. Around that endo, you have the peri, and then you have the epi. Last thing I'm going to talk about is lever systems. When people talk about muscles, a lot of times they like to talk about lever systems. So type 1, you pull here, and you get a slight movement up here, as you would if you pull on the neck. Resistance is here, becoming this way. Type 2 is pretty much what you find in your ankle. What ends up happening is you have your fulcrum here, your resistance here, and your force is here. And so you pull this way to get this to move this way. Your resistance to move up. So fulcrum is here. So like I said, it's like going on your toes. The last one is a type 3. In type 3, it's biceps area, where what you have is you have angle here, you have the force acting here, pulls up this way, your fulcrum is here, and your resistance is here. So what you have is you have a weight, and when you pull this up, this will move up too. So those are actually the 3 types you have, and that's almost all I'm going to talk about. The other thing is a lot of times people talk about the type 1 and the type 2 muscle fibers. The truth is there's not one which is just type 1 or one that is just type 2, but if you were to try to make it such, you can end up determining that type 2 are fast twitch, which tend to fatigue but are really quick, and type 1 are going to be slow twitch and don't fatigue too well. So if you think about it, your type 1 are going to be your postural muscles, like your back. Your type 2 are going to be found in your arms and legs. And you do have type 2A and type 2B. Physio deals a lot with that. So with that, I will stop, and hopefully I didn't go over it. Goodbye.